Welcome back to Hoosier History, Legends, and Heroes. Welcome to part 2 of Ernie Pyle, Hoosier Farm Boy to Pulitzer Prize-winning war correspondent. If you haven't watched part 1 of Ernie Pyle, I do recommend you taking the time to watch it before watching this video. For a quick review, Ernie was born on August 3, 1900 to Will and Maria Pyle, just south of Dana, Indiana. In July of 1925, Ernie would marry Geraldine Seabolds. Geraldine went by the nickname Jerry. Ernie had quite the journalistic career working for the Scripps Howard newspapers. He was in England in March of 1941, covering the war when his mother passed away. At this time, America was not in the war, and England was fighting for her very existence. Part 1 ended with Ernie back in the United States with plans on visiting his father and going to his new home in Albuquerque and spending time with Jerry. Then he planned on going back to being Ernie Pyle, roving reporter. I want to mention things that I didn't talk about in Part 1, but will become more important in this video. Ernie suffered from depression and a lack of self-confidence and inferiority at times. Being a farm boy, he felt that he wasn't as good as the city kids. This would affect his writing when at times he just didn't feel it was good enough. He would be met with praise from his superiors on the quality of his work. Sadly, Jerry too suffered from depression, and her episodes would become so bad that there were times she would be institutionalized. Back in the United States, Ernie traveled to Dana to visit his dad and Aunt Mary. Ernie wrote telling that his father drove to Indianapolis to meet him at the train. He would say that when they shook hands, there were no tears in his father's eyes, and he was glad. When they reached home and Aunt Mary came rushing out to meet him, she did not cry, and he was glad. But when his mother's dog Snooks came running up, she was sad and lost. He would write that Snooks was the only one who let on, and her loneliness cut as deeply as though she had shed tears. For Snooks spoke in her wordless aimlessness the void that my mother left behind her when she went away. Ernie would go alone to the cemetery to visit his mother's grave. After some time, he would leave his father and Aunt Mary, as he had done many times in the past, and he would head to his home in Albuquerque. He would fly to New Mexico and was met by a friend while Jerry was waiting for him at the house. Their home was built on a knoll with a view of the west that could be seen for miles and miles. The porch light was on, and he actually rang the doorbell instead of walking right in. Jerry had decorated the house, buying furniture, hanging pictures, all while Ernie was in England. In the back of his mind, he knew it wouldn't be long before the travel would start again, and he would be writing his columns. Ernie is back at it. He travels to Fort Bliss, Texas, earns himself a uniform by finding out firsthand what it is like for the inductees when they first enter the Army. During his physical, his weight was 113 pounds. He stayed with a cavalry regiment. At Lowry Field in Colorado, he would teach a colonel how to roll his own cigarettes. He writes about how the airport in Albuquerque is taken over by the Army Air Corps and erected 103 buildings and a new subdivision of 100 houses because the Army Air Corps wants to keep big bombers away from the coast. In Los Angeles, Ernie visited Lockheed Aircraft, where building bombers has increased big time. Lockheed received 25,000 applications each week, and out of this group, only 1,000 would get hired. They would take a temperament test, an intelligence test, and the final test was being examined by a doctor. Because of all the people coming from all over the country to California for the good jobs at Lockheed, housing would become a major hurdle to overcome. A trailer company begins building the factory and the trailers at the same time. So a trailer park is formed for out-of-state defense employees to live. Okay, at this time, we are not in the war, but with the buildup of the military and bombers, well, I think that pretty much screams that some people in high places pretty much knew we would be entering the war at some time in the future. You don't have a military buildup like this for nothing. Things would become worse for Jerry. While Ernie was in Canada, a medical emergency put her in the hospital and Ernie rushed home. Scripps Howard had Ernie take leave time so he could stay with Jerry. They announced in the newspapers that Ernie is on leave because his wife is very ill. While all of this was going on in Ernie's private life, his fans had asked that his columns about his time in England be put in book form, and they got their wish. Ernie Pyle in England was published. This was Ernie's first book, but not his last. The book was sold for 50 cents, which included tax and postage. Before December 7th, 1941, Ernie is still on leave from the paper, but he plans on being back shortly. He's already making plans for future travel when he returned to work. He was talking to his superiors about visiting the Philippines, Hong Kong, Singapore, the East Indies, and possibly even Australia and New Zealand. Jerry said she was fine with him leaving the country and that she would stay home. Plans were being made. It was planned for him to leave on December 2nd. Twice he was bumped from his modes of transportation by the Army. And then, in the early hours of Sunday morning, December 7th, 1941, Japan pulls off a sneak attack against America at Pearl Harbor, Oahu, Hawaii. Over 2,400 Americans were killed, with over 1,100 wounded. On that day, President Roosevelt would say, "This is a date that will live in infamy." He went before Congress on December the 8th to declare war on Japan. He let his fans know that all of his previous plans were canceled. He writes that he was still in Albuquerque when he heard the news about Pearl Harbor and had spent that Sunday in a daze. The news was just too horrible. Albuquerque took it hard, for in the Philippines there were 2,000 New Mexico boys. Monday was just the same. He doesn't remember at all what he did that day. I imagine it was very similar to how Americans felt after 9/11. Americans were in shock and disbelief. Ernie would write that just after dark on that Monday, there was a frightful rumor that 2 Japanese carriers were off of San Francisco and that the entire coast was to be blacked out. He also wrote, "That was enough for me. It was definitely some place to go, something you could tie your emotions to. So I went to the phone and asked how soon I could get a plane. They said at 5 the next morning. So on Tuesday morning, December 9th, Ernie was back to work and heading to California." He writes about something he is familiar with, the blackouts at night. He lived through those for months in England. This wasn't new for him, but it was for America. The military had sentries ride horses up and down the beaches at night to watch out into the Pacific Ocean just in case. America was at war. Ernie was back to traveling and writing. Jerry at home wasn't doing well. He would travel up and down the West Coast, depressed, worried about Jerry, and just feeling helpless because he didn't know how to help her. He drove home to Albuquerque so they could talk. Could they go on as they were? He would leave and head east, and when he reached Amarillo, he turned around and headed back home. They would be divorced on April 14th, 1942. There was hope that this would shock Jerry out of her melancholy and irresponsibility and that they might marry again in the future. This attempt to help Jerry was agreed upon by Jerry's doctors, her nurse, and Jerry's family. And since Ernie Pyle was now well known, the divorce was published in papers all over the country. Soon after the divorce, Jerry was back in the sanitarium. But then a few months later, Jerry seemed much improved. She went home and got a job as a clerk at the Army Airport in Albuquerque. Ernie had stayed at the house for a few days, then went to Washington and made the decision to go back overseas. The plan is for Ernie to spend a 6-month tour of war zones, and when he returns to America, he would enlist as an officer in Air Corps intelligence. He was to visit the American soldiers in Great Britain and write his columns. After the divorce, he is miserable and writes to Jerry, letting her know that he desperately wants her to get better. He will tell Jerry in a letter that he may go to Africa or someplace in the fall, and he writes, "I really feel that I can never be successful with the columns again." On June 19, 1942, Ernie landed at the Shannon Airport in Ireland. I didn't know that Ireland had remained neutral during the war. But by the time Ernie was in Ireland, 150,000 Irishmen had volunteered to fight with the British. The Irish did allow the American military to live and train in their country. Ernie would write that the troops are well, but living in Ireland makes them miss American things and their hometowns. But the main thing is they want to get the war over with and get back home. He would also tell about the Irish suffering from fuel shortages, which created major problems from trying to heat their homes to cooking their meals. They normally received coal from Wales, and it was now in short supply. Also peat, which was another source of fuel for the Irish, and there was plenty of it, but so many men had left and gone to England to work, there weren't many peat cutters left in the country. So even though Ireland was neutral, the war was making life difficult for her citizens. We know that Ernie talked to everyone, no matter what their rank, and the soldiers and sailors were happy to share their stories. He would find the sailors in the town of Derry took drastic measures to keep the colleens, and those were the local young ladies, from dating the officers. The sailors would tell the girls that the men wearing gold braid had a contagious disease and should be avoided. And if the man had red stripes on his sleeves, and this meant that they were petty officers, that meant they were criminals and out on parole. Ernie doesn't say if it worked very well for the sailors or not, but you've got to give them credit for trying. After about 6 weeks in Ireland, Ernie took the overnight boat to England. He writes about the Red Cross running many big hotels all over the world for the American troops while they were on leave. They weren't running the hotels for profit, but to help keep the soldiers happy. The War Department designated the Red Cross as the one and only civilian organization to serve the American troops abroad. Ernie would tell how the Londoners were very welcoming to the American soldiers. The Red Cross had a list of 7,000 families ready and eager to have the soldiers visit for tea or a meal. The soldiers weren't going, though, and the British were beginning to have hurt feelings. The reason is that the soldiers don't have a lot of free time, and they are wanting to sightsee and enjoy some time in the local pubs. Ernie would tell the story about a wealthy Londoner who had given a garden party with a blanket invitation for 100 American troops. Only 2 showed up. So, they were slowing down on the home invitation idea. Soldiers were meeting and making friends with the English, so more personal invitations were being made and accepted. We find out that there are American female flyers in England ferrying warplanes around England for the RAF, and one of them, Helen Ritchie, was a friend of Ernie's, and she had also been a friend of Amelia Earhart's. These women flyers would deliver new planes from factories to airdromes. They took planes to have guns tested. They would also fly damaged planes back to shops for repairs. These brave women had to have been a major help to the war effort. Ernie writes about sleeping in a tent in England in the late fall, and that it is absolutely no fun. He had slept in trains, boats, airplanes, and trucks, but sleeping in tents was the worst. There was no heat and no lighting. It was a struggle every night to try to stay warm while trying to get a good night's sleep. After reading Ernie's article about the struggles for Ernie and the soldiers, a World War I veteran wrote to Ernie telling him the method used by the soldiers in 1918. In late September, Ernie received a tip that he might be following American soldiers to North Africa. On November the 8th, American invasion forces landed in Morocco and Algeria. This was Operation Torch. Operation Torch lasted from November the 8th through the 16th. Ernie followed, sailing in a convoy of ships, and he landed in Algeria on November 23, 1942. America had already been battling with the Japanese in the Pacific. But now, on the other side of the world, American soldiers entered the war from training in England with Operation Torch. Ernie would write, without exception, the soldiers would admit they were scared stiff. He also wrote, don't get the wrong idea from that. They kept going forward, but it was their first time under fire, and being human, they were frightened. Operation Torch would be an Allied victory, but at a terrible cost. America would suffer 526 dead, and the United Kingdom 574 dead. Ernie would write how the American soldiers were met with cheers and kisses when they entered Oran. One tank officer told his story of being in the first American tank that entered the city. The local people didn't know at first who it was as they gathered around the tank. Was it the French, the British, or the Americans? The American officer finally stuck his head out of the turret and was asked something in French he didn't understand, and would say something back in English. The crowd recognized the American accent, and then the cheering started. Women kissed him, and the crowd nearly carried him away. He would say that his face was covered in lipstick for the next several hours. The American army would find that the Germans had taken everything from the local people, and they were starving. The American army donated huge food stocks to the city. The first wave of Americans that came ashore only had their canned field rations, but as they looked on the hungry children, they gave all of it away, living on oranges until more supplies arrived. After Oran, the American army moved into Tunisia. Ernie stayed behind in Oran to write his stories, and in typical Ernie Pyle fashion, he would make friends with practically everyone, including the censors. And yes, everything the correspondents wrote had to go through the censors before their stories were published in the papers back home. After the victory in Oran, the army allowed former officials to maintain their positions, and it was known then that there were German collaborators, and some were still pro-Germany. The military didn't want the folks back home to know about this. Some counterintelligence agents talked to Ernie, urging him to write about it. And at the same time, newly arrived sailors told Ernie that the people back home thought the fighting in North Africa was basically a cakewalk, that there had been practically no American casualties, and that the Vichy French in Algeria just loved the Americans, and that all German influence had been cleaned out. These thoughts could be nothing further from the truth, and Ernie wanted the folks back home to realize how things really were in North Africa. Ernie would write 2 columns. One would tell how the American soldiers were green, undersupplied troops, and they would need months, not weeks, to match the fighting capacity of their German opponents. And as for the disciplining of French collaborators, Our fundamental policy still is one of soft gloving snakes in our midst. Believe it or not, the articles made it through the censors and were published back home in the American papers, which caused a minor uproar with the public. Plus, I'm sure you can guess that there were a few people back home who were not happy about his articles being published. If Ernie knew how his articles had passed 2 different sets of censors to be published as written, he never said a word. Some believe it could be that Ernie was never political. His writings were only about people, not policy. And when the censors saw that they were articles written by him, they were approved without even being read. Another thought is that there were others who wanted this information to be made public and let his articles go through. The Garden of Allah was a desert airdrome at Biskra, an oasis in the Algerian desert. In early January of 1943, Ernie arrives at Biskra. Up to now, he has not been near the front lines of the fighting. This was going to change, and quickly. He was at the Garden of Allah for 3 hours when the Germans started bombing the airdrome. He was introduced to the soldiers' love of the slit trench. Not long after the bombing had finished, he watched as returning American flyers lowered the body of a fallen pilot head first down from his plane. After a few weeks with the Air Corps, he would move on to the American infantry units. At one time, Ernie thought he would only spend a little time at the front with the soldiers and then move on to the plans he had made before Pearl Harbor. But he found that he wanted to stay with the infantry and not move on. He would write about the conditions of the soldiers in a way that no one else seemed able to do. A Captain Atkins found a Jeep for Ernie to use to drive to different base camps to meet and talk to the soldiers. He would join the soldiers in the line for chow, and he would start up friendly conversations. He would jot down names and hometowns and sometimes even addresses of the soldiers he talked to and put those in his articles. The families back home eagerly read his columns, hoping to find the names of their loved ones. They would clip out the articles and mail them back to the soldiers so that they could read the articles that they were mentioned in. Ernie's close friend, Lee Miller, said that this is when Ernie's love affair with G.I. Joe would begin. Ernie regretted the divorce. He hoped that they would remarry. He wrote Jerry all the time and wanted desperately to hear from her. He would write to her caregiver, asking her that when she felt Jerry was strong enough to let her know that he wanted for them to remarry. On March 12, 1943, he would get a cable from the United Press in London saying that he was now a married man and they wanted to hear all about it. They were remarried by proxy, with E.H. Schaefer, a close friend to both of them, standing in for Ernie. He had been married for 2 days by the time he received the cable, because the ceremony had taken place on the 10th. In November of 1942, Ernie's columns were printed in 42 newspapers, 22 for the Scripps Howard papers and 20 for the United Feature papers. At that time, it was believed that his following was about 3.3 million Americans. He's now in Northern Africa, and by January 1st of 1943, the number of papers had increased to 65. By the end of March, his column was now in 82 papers, and the month of April saw at least 40 more papers signing on to carry his column, bringing his readership to 122 papers, with what was believed to be more than 9 million readers. The London press was printing excerpts from his column, and they called him the most popular war correspondent in America. And now there was talk about a second book, publishing his writings from his articles about Northern Africa. By May of 1943, an Allied victory is assured in Northern Africa, with the final fighting in Tunisia, And we know the Germans weren't just going to give up, and the Allies had to fight till Germany surrendered on May 13th. Ernie was right there with the soldiers as they marched and fought and died. He would write that he loves the infantry because they are the underdogs. They are the mud, rain, frost, and wind boys. They have no comforts, and they even learn to live without the necessities. And in the end, they are the guys that wars can't be won without. Following is an excerpt from an article he wrote about troops coming out of battle. The men are walking. Their walk is slow, for they are dead weary, as you can tell even when looking at them from behind. Every line and sag of their bodies speaks their inhuman exhaustion. They don't slouch. It is the terrible deliberation of each step that spells out their appalling tiredness. They are young men, but the grime and whiskers and exhaustion make them look middle-aged. The line moves on, but it never ends. All afternoon, men keep coming around the hill and vanishing eventually over the horizon. They are just guys from Broadway and Main Street, but you wouldn't remember them. They are too far away now. They are too tired. Their world can never be known to you, but if you could see them just once, just for an instant, you would know that no matter how hard people work back home, they are not keeping pace with these infantrymen in Tunisia. It's now May 1943. The Allies pushed the German army out of northern Africa. General George Patton was removed to start planning the invasion of Sicily. General Omar Bradley was left in charge. Ernie writes that he's heading back to Algeria for a bath and to do laundry. He had letters to read and newspaper columns to write. After that, what he's going to do is anybody's guess. Thank you for watching part 2 of Ernie Pyle, Hoosier farm boy to Pulitzer Prize-winning World War II war correspondent. I hope you enjoyed learning more about his personal life with Jerry, plus where America's entry into the war took him, to Ireland, back to England, and eventually the front lines in northern Africa. Part 3 is coming, and you'll be able to rejoin Ernie and learn what life had in store for him after he left northern Africa. Be sure to subscribe, like, share, and leave a comment if you like. Be sure to click on the notification bell so that you will be notified when the next Hoosier History, Legends, and Heroes video is uploaded. Until next time,